Hello Year 10, it's Mrs. Chillingworth. I am experimenting with filming a lesson for you, so do please bear with me if everything goes a bit shaky. So, welcome to day 1 of home learning. I will be doing daily lessons on and in spectacles using this fabulous visualiser that Mrs. Harrison has given me to try and guide you through studying in spectacles at home. So everything that you need is on class charts and is on Office 365. But remember, if you need any help at all or you can't find the work, just email me through Office 365 and I will get you set up. So hopefully what you should be able to see right now is the PowerPoint. So we're going to try and continue just as we do with our normal lessons, okay? So we're looking at aristocrat as our new word today, and we're looking at privilege. Now, those of you that were in the last couple of days of term may have done the start of this lesson, but we'll be moving on to new things a little bit later on. So, as usual, you can see the questions that are there. Which family is presented as not being privileged in A Christmas Carol? So, just give yourself a minute to try and remember the answer to that. Remember, you can always pause the video while you're writing as well. And then we're thinking today about what an aristocrat is. So, an aristocrat is your upper class. Okay, you're very, very top of the social ladder. Now, the only way to become an aristocrat is to either be born into a family where you would inherit the land and the title and the wealth that would often go back generations and generations and generations, or you could marry into an aristocratic family, but it was very much something you were born into or you could marry into. You could also be given a knighthood from the Queen or King, but this would technically make you a member of the aristocracy, but your status wouldn't be as high as someone who was born that way. So let's go back to our first slide then. So we should now know that aristocrats obviously belong in the top of the social class, your upper class. I'm just going to give you a minute to think about what privileges aristocrats would have. So again, pause the video if you need to have a think. So privileges then. Wealth would be the obvious one, and everything that goes along with wealth. Security, very good education, a wonderful place to live, fancy clothes. You would be able to do lots of wonderful leisure activities like going to the theatre, but you would have the respect and the status that just did not belong in other classes. So our knowledge goal today is to analyse and evaluate how Priestley uses deliberate language choices to reference the class system in Act 1. So we're going to be reading the start of the play today. So by the end of this video lesson, you should know some more detailed information about the class system in 1912, how Priestley uses language to present the class system through the words and actions of the Burling family and Gerald at the start of the play. So again, I'm going to give you a minute or pause the video to just write down the knowledge goal. So, social class then, or the social ladder. Now, in this play, it's useful to try and visualise social class as a ladder, because what we see with the Burling family is that they are constantly trying to climb to the top of it. So, at the very top of the ladder, you had your aristocracy. As we said before, you could only be born into this class or be married into it. You would have your royalty, your dukes, your lords, or anybody that received a knighthood. Below them, then, you have the upper middle class. Now, these were often as wealthy as the upper classes, but they've made their money, or their families have made that money and passed that wealth on to them, rather than having inherited it as being a duke or a lord, for example. So you could be someone like a banker, a doctor, a lawyer, but what's most important to the study of Inspector Calls is this idea of factory owners or big business owners. Now, we know from our study of A Christmas Carol that in the 19th century there was the Industrial Revolution, the rise of manufacturing, the rise of factories, and this meant that people who owned factories, bought factories, developed factories and their own means of production, when this first happened, found that they made a lot of money very, very quickly. So typically those people that owned these factories would, of course, as capitalists, get all of that profit. So they would have a huge fortune. But even if they had all of this money, they still did not have the status of the aristocracy. And that's very, very relevant to the Burling family that we're about to meet when we start reading the play. So you then had the lower middle class. So these were your skilled workers or labourers. So someone who, worked with their hands, but it was very much a skill, some training that they needed. People like shopkeepers or small shop owners, civil servants, like teachers or policemen. Your regular sort of policeman would very much be your sort of lower middle class, which again, considering the play is called An Inspector Calls, is very relevant to the play. What you then have at the bottom of the ladder is your working class. Now, these are the factory workers, your unskilled labourers. Now, that means that you don't have any particular training or education that requires you to do that job. Anyone off the streets can do it. People like miners, shop employees as well would be considered the working class. Now, obviously, these are people who did not have very much money. Think the Cratchits, okay, in A Christmas Carol. They would very much be the working class. They have a wage, a very small one. They just about get by, okay? Now, at the very, very bottom of the ladder, you have the poor. Now, they were your unemployed, your criminals, or, again, relevant to An Inspector Calls, the prostitutes. So the poor were people that often could be homeless, lived in tiny little rooms, people who didn't have employment. And what we need to remember about 1912 is that there was no welfare system. There was no benefits. There was no NHS. There was no means of social support. We also know that J.B. Priestley was a socialist. We know that he was very against social class. He was against the inequality. He was against the exploitation of workers. So we also know that he was a supporter of the Labour Party in 1945. And, their manifesto was very much about bringing social support, bringing things like the welfare system to support the poor, to support the working class, and to try and bridge that gap, that inequality gap that existed. So it's really important to make some notes on whatever you're writing on, pause this, copy this out, because An Inspector Calls is essentially a play about social class. If A Christmas Carol is a play about poverty, changing the way the rich view the poor, changing the hearts and minds of 19th century society, An Inspector Calls does lots of similar things, but it really focuses on this idea of class. Okay, and we see that all of the characters in the play represent these different areas of the social ladder. So I'm going to attempt to move this visualizer now to my copy of An Inspector Calls. So if it goes a bit wibbly for a minute, you'll just have to sort of put up with that. So what I'm going to do in these videos is I've printed out a copy of the play. If you don't have a copy on you, you should have a copy linked to you, a Word document on Office 365. Now, if you can't print this out, please email me, because we can print you out one at school and we can send it to you, okay? Because ideally you need your own physical copy that you can annotate and you can make notes, okay? If you don't have a copy, you can just make some notes on a bit of paper as we're writing, okay? But I am going to do my very best to annotate this with you. So, I know my class certainly have already looked at the opening stage directions. We can see that we have the characters there, even though Sybil is spelt wrong in this. Okay, so we have Arthur Burling, the head of the Burling family, his wife, Sheila Burling, who is his daughter, Eric Burling, who is his son, Edna, their maid, Gerald Croft, a friend of the family, and then the Inspector Ghoul, who we meet later on. You will see that all 3 acts are continuous, so they follow on from one another, and they take place in the dining room of the Burlings house in Brumley. Now, Brumley was an industrial city in the North Midlands. Okay, industrial city means that there were lots and lots of factories. So we're just going to go through the opening stage directions just in case you haven't looked at them yet, because again, I know that attendance was a little bit patchy last week. So this is really important. 1912. So we're going to take a minute to think. 1912, why is that an important date? Now, hopefully in your head, you're thinking World War I happened in 1914. 2 years after this date. And then, of course, following on from that, we had World War II, and we know that the play was first performed in 1946. So Priestley sets this play in 1912 for a very, very specific reason. So all the way through is our old friend, dramatic irony. Now remember, dramatic irony is when we, the reader or the audience, because remember this is a play, it was meant to be watched, we know something the characters don't. So if you have an audience in 1946, they are going to know that this family sitting in 1912 think everything's great, but they have no idea that they will live through not 1 but 2 world wars that an audience in 1946 would know is going to completely just change and transform society. Okay? So, we can see that it is a dining room in a fairly large suburban house belonging to a prosperous manufacturer. So, fairly large, we're already getting an idea of their wealth. Suburban means that it's on the outskirts of town. So, they're wealthy. They don't want to live in the smog-ridden city with all the pollution from the factories. Now, prosperous means successful. And if he's a manufacturer, he's a factory owner. So hopefully we should already be thinking, well, okay, if this family, the head of the family, is a factory owner, then we know that this is an upper middle class family. Now again, this is really, really important because what they are not are aristocrats, but what they are is very, very rich. Just walking around trying to make my lights turn back on. There we go. So, we also see that it has good, solid furniture of the period. So again, solid furniture, we get this idea of their wealth. Priestley wants to establish this is a family who has money. The general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cosy and home-like. Now this is really important because Priestley's doing something very subtle and clever here. He's telling us that it's heavily comfortable, it's substantial, it's a lovely place to live, but it's not cosy, it's not home-like, it doesn't feel like a home. Now what we can infer from this is that this is symbolising the fact that the Burling family aren't close. On the outside, they appear to be your very upper middle class, perfect family. But actually, all of that wealth and all of that status hides the fact that they're not a cosy, home-like, close family. And again, it's really important to keep all of this in mind when we actually start reading the dialogue in a minute. Okay, we're not going to read the rest of this paragraph because it really is just instructions to a director. Okay, the thing we are going to look at though is the lighting. Now remember, this is a play, so you should write about the stage directions, you should write about things like the lighting. So at the start it should be pink and intimate, so when they're having this engagement dinner that we read about. So we've got this idea of happy, cosy, but actually when the inspector arrives it should become brighter and harder, almost like this idea of an interrogation. Okay, sorry, that's not spelt very well. Okay, this idea of an interrogation. Because what the inspector is going to do then, what we can infer from this, is that he is going to really shine a spotlight on the Burling family. And he's really going to try and crack through this idea that on the outside they're really heavily comfortable, but on the inside they're not cosy and home-like. There are secrets there that the inspector's going to try and get out of them. So this next paragraph is really important because what we have is key information about the characters. Now in an essay we always know once you've tracked the extract you go back to the beginning of the text, so you really want to start in an exam situation with this opening character description. So we've got the four Burlings and Gerald are seated at the table with Arthur Burling at one end, his wife at the other. Eric's downstage and Sheila and Gerald are seated upstage. Now this is interesting. So we have Sheila and Gerald upstage and then Eric downstage. Now from this we can infer that Sheila is the favoured child. Okay? She's upstage. She's important. And we're going to look and think about why Sheila might be more important to Mr. and Mrs. Burling than Eric, and what Sheila can do for the social status of the family. So Edna, the parlour maid, another sign of their wealth, is just clearing the table, which has no cloth, of dessert plates, champagne glasses, replacing them with a decanter of port, a cigar box and cigarettes. So again, this is a family that have had a nice dinner, a nice celebration. They've again obviously got money with their champagne, their cigars, their port, etc. All five are in evening dress of the period, the men in tails and white ties, not dinner jackets. So again, they're in very posh, fancy clothes. So now we have a sentence on each of the characters, and it's really important, again, if you were in maybe Wednesday or Thursday, we did have a go at doing this. If you weren't in, you need to make sure that you are writing this down. So Arthur Burling, the head of the family, okay, he is the prosperous manufacturer. He's heavy looking. Now, that basically means he's slightly overweight. But we know that that used to be a sign of wealth. Okay, you could afford to overindulge. He's portentous. Now, portentous means that he's a bit of a know-it-all. Okay? He thinks he knows everything. And we'll see that Mr. Burling likes making big speeches where he likes everyone to benefit from his good advice. Sorry, I know that it's a little bit blurry. Hopefully we can see that. Okay. There we go. So he's in his middle 50s with fairly easy manners. Now this is quite interesting because what we can infer from that is that his manners are quite relaxed. From that we can infer that he doesn't have the breeding of a typical upper class man. Now, by this, what I mean is if you were brought up, from birth in the upper classes or the aristocracy, you would be expected to behave and conduct yourself, your manners, in a very certain, very strict way. From this, we can infer that whilst Mr. Burling is a member of the upper class because of the wealth that he has accumulated as a result of his factory, his family is probably not from the upper class originally. Maybe they were lower middle class and have made their money. He's very much what you would call a self-made man. And he's very proud of this, Mr. Burling. He's very proud about the fact that he's worked for what he's got. But it means that he doesn't have the breeding or the manners of someone from that class originally. Now, finally, we have he's rather provincial in his speech. Now, I'm running out of room a little bit, but this basically means that he loves the sound of his own voice. He loves making big speeches, giving everyone the benefit of what he considers to be his wisdom. Okay? So, in your exercise books, write down some of those quotes, heavy-looking, portentous, fairly easy manners, provincial, and just write some notes. Pause the video, write a few notes about what impression you get of Arthur Burling. Okay? So his wife, this is Sybil Burling, is again about 50, a rather cold woman. Now, what we can infer from this is she's not physically cold, okay? She's emotionally cold. Okay, she's an emotionally cold, distant woman. And now this, one of the most important quotes on this page, she is Mr. Burling's social superior. Now, this means that her family is from a higher social class than Mr. Burling's. Okay? So it's really important to write down. Her family is from a higher social class than Mr. Burling's. Now, what we can infer from that is maybe they didn't marry for love. Maybe because Mr. Burling had quite a lot of money, he was a rather attractive prospect for Mrs. Burling's family. Now, we don't know whether Mrs. Burling was a member of the aristocracy or whether she was a member of the upper class and Mr. Burling was a member of the, family member of the lower class or lower middle class. We're not given that specific detail. But if we think Mrs. Burling's not the type of character to necessarily marry for love, then we've got to assume that her family needed the money. Now, sometimes, even if you were an aristocrat, you might have the title, the fancy house, the land, but what you didn't have is any actual real cash. Through bad investment, through gambling habits, through ancestors being bad with money, you did often have people who had that social status, but they didn't have a lot of money, and it was very common for them to marry socially beneath them to actually get that injection of money into the family. So again, we don't know for 100% sure, Priestley doesn't explicitly tell us, but you can infer that Mr. and Mrs. Burling had that sort of relationship from these stage directions. Okay, and again, looking at their dialogue with one another, it becomes really important when we start reading the play. So again, write down in your books or on your paper the fact that she's a cold woman, her husband's social superior. Pause the video and just make some notes. Your first impressions of these characters is so important. So Sheila then. Sheila is a pretty girl in her early 20s. She's pleased with life and rather excited. So let's imagine you are Sheila in 1912, okay? Young girl, rich family. Sheila's life, the expectation of the way Sheila will live her life is that she will have been brought up to be accomplished. She probably can have some skills. Maybe she can play the piano, maybe she can embroider, but she's very much been groomed to be a good wife to a wealthy man, either of her class or ideally of a higher class. She needs to look pretty, be well-spoken, be able to make polite conversation, know how to conduct herself in society, hang on Gerald's arm at dinner parties, make him look good, and eventually give her husband children. Sheila, as a young girl, would have been incredibly sheltered. Now, not on the same level as Juliet from Romeo and Juliet that we studied, obviously last term, but there are definite similarities there. Sheila will know what her parents want her to know. Sheila will believe what her parents want her to believe. She will be very, very naive, very, very shallow, very, very sheltered. Now that's really important when we look at the development of her character, is that Priestley is developing her as a character throughout this play. So again, the fact that she's pretty is important because it's going to help her get a husband. Now, of course, she's pleased with life and rather excited. Sheila's never had to worry really about anything in her entire life. So life is going to be pretty good for a girl like Sheila. So again, jot down some notes, write a few sentences. What is your first impression of Sheila? So we now have Gerald Croft. Just going to correct that capital letter there. Gerald Croft is an attractive chap. So he's handsome, good looking, about 30, so a little bit older than Sheila, but not too old. He's rather too manly to be a dandy. Now, a dandy was sort of a word for a man that took just a little bit too much care over his appearance, was almost maybe a little bit effeminate. So Gerald's attractive, well presented, well dressed, but not in an effeminate way. He's very manly. And this is really important, but very much the well-bred young man about town. Now, we find out, there's no spoiler because we're going to literally find it out in a couple of pages' time, that Gerald, he's an aristocrat. He has a higher social class than the Burling family. He's well-bred. He knows exactly how to behave. So we can already see how someone like Gerald may be connecting to the family. And again, it doesn't take a genius to infer that he's likely sitting around this dinner table because of Sheila Burling. And again, we find that out in a minute. So again, pause, jot down some of those quotes, make a few notes on what impression you get of Gerald. So finally, we have Eric, the son. He's also in his early 20s, so him and Sheila are of a similar age. Not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. Now let's take a moment to think about if you're